Testing active range of movement for flexion and extension at the elbow. I ask the client to touch their fingers to their shoulders and then return to the anatomical position. Testing active range of movement gives us as practitioners an indication as to how far the client feels comfortable to move at the joint. Next is active wrist flexion and extension. For this, I ask the client to have their palms flat on the bed and lift their fingers as far as they can go for extension. And for flexion, I ask the client to have their palms facing the ceiling and lift their fingers as far as they can go. Active range of movement for elbow pronation and supination. For pronation, their palms move to face the bed, and for supination, they face the sky, all whilst keeping their elbows still. This is active ulnar deviation and radial deviation. For radial, I ask them to point their fingers in towards each other, and for ulnar, for them to point their fingers away from each other. Active flexion and extension at the finger joints. For flexion, I ask them to create a fist, and for extension, I ask them to straighten their hands flat out. For active thumb flexion and extension, I ask the client to point their thumb up to the ceiling and then down to the couch. For active abduction and adduction of the thumb, I ask the client to have their hand face up and move their thumb away from the body for abduction and towards the other hand for adduction. Testing active opposition, I ask them to get their pinky to touch their thumb. Testing passive flexion and extension of the elbow. I do this by moving the joint by myself while securing the elbow and the wrist. This allows for the end feel to be tested, which should be firm in extension and elastic during flexion. Here is testing passive extension of the wrist. I test this by pushing the hand back at the palm and then separately testing by pushing the hand at the fingertips, which puts more strain on the wrist joint and makes extension more difficult. Similarly, this is the passive test for wrist flexion. This is the test for passive range of movement for pronation and supination. For supination, I move the palm towards the bed, and for pronation, I move their palm to the ceiling. Supination should be around 30 degrees and pronation around 20. Comparing the client to these values allows us to identify limitations to bony structures or connective tissues such as tendons and ligaments. Next is testing passive range of movement for finger flexion. I support the wrist and push the fingers to curl in towards their palm. For many clients such as this one, this will not show their full potential of the movement at the joint, as the palm prevents the fingers from moving any further. This is testing passive flexion and extension of the thumb, which is a carpometacarpal joint. Similarly, here I am testing abduction and adduction of the thumb, moving away for abduction and towards for adduction. This is testing passive deviation of the wrist or radiocarpal joint. I move the fingers towards the midline of the body for radial deviation and then away from the midline of the body for ulnar deviation. They should have more range of movement in radial than in ulnar. Testing isotonic resisted range of movement for the elbow joint. This requires an external force. I apply force to the client's arm towards the couch and they resist me by pulling their hand up towards their shoulder. Similarly, this is also testing flex resistance, but this time isometrically, meaning that the muscles remain the same length whilst contracting to resist the force I am applying to it. This is resisted isotonic elbow extension. I push the hand up towards the shoulder while the client resists me and pushes their arm back towards the couch. Isotonic means that the muscles change length whilst contracting to resist the force I'm applying to the joint. Similarly, this is resisted isometric extension. Without causing any movement, the client tries to straighten their arm while I push their arm in towards flexion. This is resisted pronation and supination of the elbow. Me and the client apply opposing forces to each other's hands and we try this in both directions. Here I am testing resisted finger flexion and extension. For extension, I push the fingers down while the client pushes their fingers up, and for flexion, the opposite. Finger flexion and extension is important to test as it gives us an insight into the stability of the wrist and its capability to support the movements of other joints in the hand. Next is testing resisted range of movement of the thumb for flexion and extension by having the hand straight, pinky on the couch and thumb towards the ceiling, and then for abduction and adduction, the hand down on the couch with the palm facing up. This is testing radial and ulnar deviation of the wrist joint. For radial, they push against my arm towards the midline of the body, and for ulnar, they push away from the midline of the body. Finally, this is the resisted test for flexion and extension of the wrist joint. Comparing on both hands allows us to identify any abnormalities or differences between them, such as the direction in which they apply force, the strength of the resistance that they exert, and any weak points throughout the fluid movement.